All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Today this lunch and learn is really gonna tackle the legal landscape of DEI, particularly around that language, following the Supreme Court decision last summer in June. And so we want to be able to set this time up for success in regards to really learning about understanding the change of the landscape, how it's impacting our partners. With Cultured Enough, we serve in people in different industries in nonprofit sector, as well as tech, K through 12, education, and then also various private service serving organizations as well. And so, although a lot of the times the legal landscape, especially if it's in the federal level, really impacts the corporate world, we want to be able to give the tools and resources to those who are in small to medium sized organizations as well, being as though that Cultured Enough serves organizations across the country, and understanding that different state legislation regulations also impact policy as well. So I'll introduce myself and then the colleague that we have on the call today. Myself is Alyssa Vasquez. I'm CEO and president of Cultured Enough. And really being able to dig deep into professional development is my heart and soul, to be able to empower CEO organizations, as well as C-suite level and manager level, so that they can create the culture that they desire to see and align it with their mission and vision as well. And so really being able to highlight the different aspects of organizational change and making sure that it's aligned across the board. And so I'll introduce my colleague right here, Alexander Nassar. We've been on panels before. And so Alexander, what I've seen from you is just your heart to be able to empower organizations so that they're making informed decisions as well within the Philadelphia area. And so if you could introduce yourself, that would be great.
Sure. I'm really happy to participate in this presentation today. It's an extremely important area for institutions to continue to prioritize, whether they're in the nonprofit sector or the for-profit sector, state employers, private employers. It impacts everyone equally. And part of my practice is helping employers not only to think about their legal compliance obligations with regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and anti-discrimination and statutes and things of that nature, but also to constructively build DEI programs that empower employers to access new talent, to make a statement in their communities, and to grow in ways that organizations that don't prioritize these initiatives just don't have access to. So over the course of my practice, I've been able to really impress upon employers that this is not just the right thing to do, although that's the A1 priority. It also is a way in which they can grow and diversify and become present in the marketplace in a way that their competitors and others don't, when they don't prioritize these initiatives. It's extremely important from both a business and an ethical perspective. And so particularly in recent years, and as the composition of the Supreme Court has shifted, and certain decisions have come out, have really been instrumental in helping my clients to build these programs from the ground up, or to modify them to bring them into compliance with the new legal landscape, or what we see coming over the horizon as this evolves over time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for availing your time as well. Really going over how we're going to look at past and present DEI programs, and understanding that some of the decisions that have been created trickle down on different states particularly, but wanting our partners to be empowered. We assist partners with DEI strategic planning. We assist them with being able to create diversity within their strategy of hiring, recruiting, and retention. And in a conversation that we had with our leadership team, I believe it was at the end of last year, and this is the beauty of when you have different people be able to contribute their thoughts as well as challenges, and have high psychological safety in the workplace. We were sitting, I was with the founder of the organization, I'm the CEO, and our associate director. And our associate director, who is a Gen Z, shout out, really kind of brought it to our attention that the landscape is changing, and understanding that as professionals and expert, Janelle Marinez, wanting to be able to see a shift in the culture. And so how can we really emphasize strategy? How can we emphasize inclusion? How can we emphasize equity by focusing on culture and really moving ourselves from DEI programming, but while still containing the same factor and the same impact that we desire to see. And so understanding that with the strategies in place, we want to be able to give our partners the tools and resources and language so that they could do that. And we're going to be able to give Alex time to be able to go over the evolving landscape within DEI and to empower you with strategies at the end. But we do ask that you consult your legal counsel in-house to be able to make moves on these strategies as well. And so as we dive into either DEI programming, looking at these programs, we understand that they were born to rectify historical injustices and disparities. We understand why they were created. Examples were affirmative action and integration, some policies that were in place in this country to help really level the playing field for different protected groups. And so now what we're seeing is that these DEI policies were crafted with the best intentions, aiming to foster fairness and equal opportunities. However, translating these ideals into tangible culture of inclusivity has posed some challenges. And so while well-intentioned, the policies didn't always fully hit the mark, teaching us an important lesson. But policy changes can shift, but cultivating a deep-rooted culture of inclusivity and understanding that this requires time and gradual shift in societal attitudes. And so while we know DEI policies and what they intended and what they were crafted to do, with hearing the change of the DEI landscape legally, we want to be able to still get to the root, still get to similar solutions, but be protected legally while doing that. And so our friend Alex here is going to go over some just legal landscapes that we want you all to be aware of, and then we'll go into strategies of how to mitigate them as well.
Sure. So the biggest news in recent history with regard to DEI initiatives in the workplace came in June of 2023 out of a Supreme Court case that actually relates to race-based affirmative action programs in higher education. And so you may be wondering, well, why am I listening to an employment lawyer talk to me about a decision that the Supreme Court rendered about affirmative action in education? What does that have to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace? What does that have to do with Title VII, which generally speaking covers the lion's share of the discrimination, anti-discrimination loss landscape in the employer context? Well, I'll tell you. But before I do that, just a brief overview of the decision, which is called Students for Fair Admissions Incorporated versus Harvard and North Carolina. There's longer titles for the, or more nuanced titles for the entities at Harvard and North Carolina that were covered, but essentially you should be mindful that it was this student advocacy organization versus Harvard versus North Carolina. And so essentially the outcome of that decision is that the Supreme Court found in a 6-3 decision that policies at Harvard and North Carolina, which would have previously permitted those universities to consider an applicant's race as part of admissions, were unlawful under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, as well as Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's not Title VII, and I'll get to that distinction in a second. This decision reversed well-established precedent, which was in place up to that point, which previously allowed colleges and universities to consider race in the admissions process to ensure that universities had diverse student populations. I'll stop there because I think that an important thing to think about is, as we talk through this conversation today, is this distinction. This Supreme Court decision, again, basically said that affirmative action, and I want to use that phrase as a term of art, right, in the education context, is not permitted in the way that it used to be. Universities can no longer consider race explicitly in their admissions process. What we should bear in mind in this process, and it's a little bit counterintuitive at first, but again, we'll talk through it, is that that consideration, that kind of affirmative action, if you want to use that term, has not been permitted, has almost never been permitted in the workplace since the inception of Title VII and its application to employers. So that's a common misconception, is that DEI is in fact a quote unquote affirmative action program for employers. It's not. But that doesn't mean, and again, we'll get into the nuance of this in a bit, that doesn't mean that employers cannot and should not have DEI initiatives which ensure as best they can that employers are pulling from diverse socioeconomic, race, other protected class pools. And how do you do that? And how do you navigate that? But the reason why this decision is so important is twofold. And it's kind of squeezing at both ends, right? What I mean by that is the first reason it's important is that the most immediate impact is that as a consequence of this Supreme Court decision, less diverse candidates are being trained in colleges and universities, which means that in 2, 3, 4 years, there will be less diverse candidates than there are now out in the workforce. And that's really saying something, because even before this decision, we've had issues with giving people from more diverse backgrounds opportunities to participate at the same level at many institutions of higher learning, and to get the same opportunities that more historically seated classes of people have enjoyed for so long, right? So in the immediate, you have an issue with just a less diverse pool of people being out there to begin with. So as we think about DEI programs, it's, well, that pool is now shrinking, and how do we still find those people and get them an interview seat and get them a position, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is that the way the Supreme Court works, this is first day of law school 101, right? The way that the common law develops in this country is that we build on precedent over time, and courts look by analogy to various rulings to make other rulings, right? And so the consequence of that overall concept here is that this may open the gates to a ruling in the future that, okay, we decided that affirmative action is not permissible in the education context. That Title VI is only one title away from Title VII. And so is what's happening with many DEI programs at employers really a quote unquote affirmative action program that by analogy, we ought to now prohibit, right? And so that's, you hear lawyers use this phrase all the time, that's a slippery slope, right? And so that's the other, and that's the other consideration. As of today, there is no law of the land that prohibits a properly calibrated DEI program in the workplace. But again, the idea here is to try to get ahead of these considerations and think about, okay, are we ready if the legal landscape shifts? Are we ready to deal with an environment where we have to encounter an even more restricted pool of diverse, so to speak, candidates? I hate even using that term, but you know, how do we deal with that, and how do we use our DEI program to still find that? So when we talk about legal direction, that's what I speak about in terms of this slippery slope type argument, right? When we talk about cultural impact, we talk about a corporate culture that as a result of these pressures might begin to clam up and say, look, it's not even worth us putting our neck out there on a DEI program. Am I going to get sued? Am I going to lose my job, you know, as an HR professional, as a C-suite executive? And so that's the cultural impact that we have to fight against by kind of spreading the message. Look, it's okay. Everything's fine. We can still talk about DEI. In fact, you should still talk about DEI, and you must. And here's how you do it, right? So that's basically the stage that we set when we talk about this current legal landscape and as we think about DEI going forward.
Yeah. And really being able to say that, can you speak to some initiatives that either are facing some backlash, such as tiebreaker decision. If you have two well-qualified candidates, some result to the person of color for the simple fact of diversifying their pipeline or their retention. Others are specific mentorship or internships that perhaps are African American or Latinx focused, to be able to increase that pipeline as well. Some of our partners look into increasing, for example, in the education sector. Currently, right now in Pennsylvania, there are only 6% educators of color throughout the entire state. And so really using numbers was the language to be able to say, how can we increase X, Y, and Z by 30% within 5 years?
Right.
And so could you speak to a little bit of the backlash that people may face when having these initiatives?
Sure. So yeah, and I can take these in turn, and there are a few more. So when you speak to hiring quotas, this is the idea that, look, we're going to set a hard and fast goal. Hey, by this time next year, we want 45% of our new hires to be women, or we want 45% of our new hires to have African ancestry, right? These types of quotas, again, are things that can get you into hot water from a legal perspective because they have never been permitted, technically.
Right.
And they technically would give somebody who is not part of that class and who feels as if they're being discriminated against or being frozen out of opportunities a predicate for a claim potentially under Title VII.
Yep.
What can you do as it relates to a pivot away from a hiring quota? Well, you can, as part of a DEI initiative, say, listen, let's look to socioeconomic status, for example. There's no statute on the books that protects rich people, right? But let's look to socioeconomic status. Let's look to historically disadvantaged groups, right? Or people from different differing backgrounds, socioeconomically speaking.
Yep.
The unfortunate reality in the United States today is that with a focus like that, an employer or an institution or a nonprofit tends to find more candidates that are diverse as we think about race, sex, disability, things like that. And I say that's the unfortunate reality because there remains, and this is a truth that we have to confront, there remains a correlation between the two, right? Alternatively, what can we do? And this kind of shifts back to the education context a little bit. Hey, are we canvassing colleges and universities that tend to have more diverse populations? When was the last time we did an on-campus interview at an HBCU? Oh gosh, we've never done that, right? Well, that's not targeting directly, a quota of people, right? But it is giving you access to a new pool of candidates that you just, for whatever reason, have never targeted before, right?
Correct.
As to tiebreaker decisions, same thing, right? When you're making the only factor of the decision, they're equal in every respect, but the only factor is that, we're going to look away from the white candidate to promote diversity, right? For example. From my prior examples and a little bit of my, remarks before, you can see how now we've brought the issue to a head, and it's the only issue that remains, and it's the only issue we're thinking about. You want to avoid doing that, but again, you can look there to say, look, here's a kid from a historically disadvantaged area that we want to give a chance versus somebody else. There's nothing race-based about that decision, nothing about that protected class, right? Or gosh, I think that their personal affect was just more what we need, right? These subjective things, right?
Got it.
That maybe their life experience brings something to the table that we could really use here. Right?
Understood.
These are the kinds of things that we want to focus on rather than a tiebreaker decision that expressly brings it up to a head, right?
Because then you're also making an assumption on that person of color, and you're making assumptions about their background, you're making assumptions about ethnicity. And so to be able to mitigate that, really making your decision based on other factors that maybe a factor that will add value or culture to the organization rather than just that as well. We want to not make people of color a monolith either. So being able to base different factors, that's great. Yep.
Correct. The next one here is group-specific internships and fellowships. My guidance on this point is as follows. There's a big difference between the employer saying, we are going to offer an internship only to women, right? Or Black and Latinx people, right? We're only going to offer that internship to them. We, the employer, this is our initiative, right? It's a big difference between that and having a relationship with another institution or organization that itself has created an initiative to say, hey, we are going to create a scholarship program for African-American youth. We are going to create an internship program where we help African-American youth get resume together and have interview skills and be able to market themselves. And me as the employer saying, you know what, I think that's a cool initiative. I'd love to work with you.
Partnerships, creating partnerships.
Big difference. There's a big difference between the two things. And it doesn't mean you're not looking elsewhere. It doesn't mean that, again, as between two candidates, interns that are equally qualified, that you may pick the African-American student over the white student just based on that factor alone. But again, you're subjecting yourself, you're looking for different opportunities in different parts of the community where you may not have looked before because you had a narrower focus. And you're getting yourself access to that talent pool. Diversity goals tied to compensation. This is one, there's not much else to say about it, but sort of strictly to avoid, a transactional relationship where like the more, diverse candidates I hire, I get a $10,000 bonus each time. That is sort of, again, directly bringing to the head the idea that, an organization will have a discriminatory bias in sourcing those candidates. Now, HR professionals can have a DEI function assigned to them. At bigger organizations, including law firms, there are people who their entire job is to administer the DEI program at the organization. But it doesn't mean that they get incentive-based compensation for doing that.
Understood. There are some partners that there is an incentive to be able to have increased the constituents that they serve, increased people of color, and it's almost added as an incentive to that. Would you say that if it's not compensation or if it's not monetary, but it is a value that a manager should uphold within this organization, is that carrying a fine line between this status?
A bit, yeah, it's a bit of a fine line, but again, the goal is to make sure that the employer is gaining access to all communities, or to a wider scope of communities, right? So it's less encouraging diversity, and more focusing on inclusion, for example. Again, this is a fine line, but the words matter.
That's really good. And that leads to cultural impact, which is one of your last points. Really looking at how throughout the country, yes, there was a precedent set, but being able to say that the culture shift of even the term DEI and how it has been weaponized. So we all remember the bridge that collapsed in Baltimore, and being able to say that the backlash of that, there were negative comments that were made about the mayor saying that this is Baltimore's DEI mayor. Look at him, almost in a demeaning sense, really being able to say that. And we know that there were certain pilots and recent plane crashes where, it was because a plane crash because of that DEI pilot. And so understanding the rhetoric behind DEI, we know Florida with the Anti-Woke Act, really being able to say that there is a negative cultural impact where there becomes more of, if you are close to these conversations or close under these state or regulations, being able to say that there's, instead of an anxiety around how do we now utilize and how do we dig into and invest in culture? How do we invest in a culture of inclusion, just like you said, Alex, of being able to say that we do want healthy culture throughout so that we can have retention of diverse talent across the board. And so is there anything you would like to speak to any
Yeah.
of these events that does have, we can't ignore it because of the simple fact that it does weaponize the term and it also has a cultural impact on people of color in the workplace, or it
Sure.
also puts weaponizing in the sense that, oh, that person of color, that's the only competency that that person had in order to get that job, and so there becomes that backlash culturally as well.
Yeah. So I think the most significant point here, as it relates to sort of my corner of the world, which is helping, employers and institutions create DEI programs, is that all too often there's a sense that, okay, we've now succeeded in bringing in a more diverse and inclusive workforce. They're here. Great.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't faced any claims, and we have a robust program on paper, and now they're here. Awesome. That's day one of the work.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Because on both sides of the coin, that is the candidate and the institution, there's so much more work to be done. There are things like code switching to confront the idea that somebody from a different background now reporting to a 50-year-old white supervisor. There are ways in which they're just not going to communicate the same way, and there are, or might not initially, and that there can be misunderstandings that happen there. There can be accusations of disparate treatment based on race on both sides, which again is the thing that Title VII is designed to protect against, and in this case is helpful to protect employees from discrimination, right? Mm-hmm. But the idea of a DEI initiative is only the beginning, is getting the person in the door. It is, as you say, Alyssa, like a cultural shift that needs to happen. Okay. It's the idea that what you are seeking when you seek a more diverse candidate pool is not to just be able to advertise it, but to be able to use it to grow and enrich the organization, and really thinking about what aspects of that person's background enrich our organization. What are they helping us think about that we never thought about before? Because that's the value add on both sides for corporate culture.
Yes.
That's one thing. Kind of blowing it out to what the bullets here on the page. Another thing to bear in mind is that we're talking about sort of precedent at the Supreme Court level, but of course, all of these considerations can be shaped by state legislatures, political pressure at the state level. The difference between the governor in Florida and the governor in Massachusetts, and political leanings. And so there are everyday political pressures, school boards, that impact a lot of our potential listeners today, and the politics that go behind that. So these things evolve every day, and it does become a political endeavor on some level, unfortunately.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And so as you think about your organizations, we would love for you to take the time to be able to observe any resistance or anticipated resistance, depending on the industry you're in, any specific roadblocks that either you've encountered or observed and that have hindered effective policies, and then any questions, if you could put them in the comments, and then we will be able to have Alex follow up with you. Alex, from your experience in working with, I know you have, client confidentiality, sure, but common themes around the companies that you work with currently to have those protected groups. What are some resistance that you've observed, especially being in Philadelphia? I'm interested because we have such a different political landscape here. And then any specific roadblocks that your clients have encountered?
Yeah. So I would say the most common one is, can't we just do this anyway? Right? Do I have to have a DEI plan? Do I have to have a DEI officer? Or can't I just go out and source Latinx applicants?
Right.
And my answer to that is always, look, again, part of this is a cultural shift. And so you need to send a very clear message across your organization about the culture that you're trying to create, rather than just sort of piecemeal going out and hiring and doing things in a patchwork. You have to have a goal. You have to have a strategy. And that needs to be communicated across the organization. It also helps to set people's expectations about changes that they'll see around the organization over time, right?
Yep. Yes.
Which can be helpful. Because again, not everybody, that's another big one, is training fatigue that I can speak to as well. But that would be a big one that I see, is like, why have a plan? And the answers for that are, again, to set those expectations, to change that culture, and also to begin to show that you're present in the marketplace as somebody who, as an institution who's welcoming to DEI initiatives. Because again, when we talk about attracting talent without setting a quota, once you start to send that message, again, you see that talent come, right?
Yes.
Training fatigue is a big obstacle.
Yes.
In some jurisdictions, training on anti-harassment and discrimination is required by state law or local law. So that can be a starting point, but it can be awkward and difficult to train on things. I mentioned code switching earlier. To train on things like that, how to see it, how to avoid it, what to do about, or not avoid it, but what to do about it. You can't really avoid it, but what to do about it, right? These are things that require, maybe role play. And how do we role play that without getting ourselves into trouble, without somebody using that to say that made me feel really awkward and maybe discriminated against? So there's a lot of sensitivities around how to craft that training and how to send the right messaging around it, right? But yeah, training fatigue is definitely one. Am I getting paid for this? I have so much to do. My inbox is so full. But again, if you go back to that plan and get buy-in from your workforce around, you know what, this is the right thing to do, or this would make us a lot better, that's a big first step. Somebody else said, resistance statement, this is mission drift. It's moving away from our original goals. I'm in a religious organization. The religious organization is a great example because, again, one would think that this kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion would be part and parcel of the tenets of most major religious institutions.
You would think,
but not always, and not always all protected classes, right? That we think about. But it goes back to what I say about, I took this job because I wanted to advance our organization, our agency's, mission as a religious organization. What does diversity have to do with that? I'm an administrator at a public school. I have enough on my hands making sure that everyone's safe and that we're hitting our metrics, right? How does this help me?
Right.
And it all goes back, I say it again, to that DEI plan, that messaging, that collateral around the idea that having this plan and following it is going to bring up the high watermark on all of those goals.
That's right. And that's one thing that we help our organizations with, is that it starts with language and being able to have that missional alignment throughout the entire organization. Every level of the organization should reflect the values and the culture that you desire to see. And we know that culture is made up of values, behaviors, and social norms. And so how do we have accountability systems built in so that we understand that even when we do get any talent or diverse backgrounds, that they also are retained as well. So we're going to get into some strategies that I'll go over that could be potential for your organization. And then Alex, feel free to interrupt and chime in if there's one that stands out to you as well. One of it is really being able to, instead of being strategic about different groups, just like Alex had mentioned, how do we level the playing field to remove bias as much as possible from the workplace? And when you're doing that, you're able to create a structured recruitment process, establishing clear merit-based criteria, ensuring that there's fairness and equality throughout the entire hiring process, whether you're doing panel hiring instead of one-on-one hiring, whether the questions that you ask are being able to have a numeric value so that you're removing bias from that process, removing stereotypical language from evaluations, being able to review benefit policy so that you're making sure everyone across the board, one, has the same benefits and is communicated to what their benefits are as well. And any changes that is communicated throughout the company. Mentorship program, just like Alex had mentioned, being able to implement mentorships for opportunities for all employees to be able to receive guidance and support in their professional growth. Making sure that a lot of the times when we do our assessments, we'll see one manager that is able to give great development for their team, but another manager is not able or is not doing that. And so there you will start to see a difference of professional growth within the organization. And then how do you being able to provide professional development to all employees? So a lot of the times organizations like to start with their DEI committee or DEI task force, and the growth stops there. What we're advocating is for all of your employees to be able to engage into development. Again, that points to the language of the organization. It points to furthering the mission. We all know that research states that when organizations and companies have diverse teams and have high psychological safety, they outperform those who do not. And so it's really being able to gauge that there's going to be benefits here culturally as well. Some other strategies is really being able to go from specific cohort participation to really create content that speaks to everyone. And so the example here was, instead of offering a program exclusively for women and their development, opening it to all employees to be able to support gender equality in general. And so really opening it up so that everyone could have focused values and similar language as well. And to Alex's one of the last examples, having employers that can invite candidates to share personal experiences related to their identity, or consider narratives that are related to their experience with race, or how it speaks to their qualities. And so instead of hiring based on race, how about we hire based on character and the value that they're going to bring to the culture of the organization as well. We want all people to be competent, and we want all people to be able to engage with diverse settings at the same time. And so shifting from impact, shifting from just a characteristic of the person to really being able to say the impact of their leadership capabilities as well. And then one of the other, go ahead.
Yeah, Alyssa, I would just add, if you could go back to the last slide really quick. One thing I wanted to emphasize is, particularly when we talk about reviewing employee benefits policies, mentorship programs, and ensuring, equal compensation, it is okay for a DEI program or company policy to have procedures in place that ensure that there is pay equity, that mentorship programs provide equal opportunities for all employees, to make sure that benefits policies are equal across the board. I'll say this: if an organization is not diligent about ensuring that, and there become inconsistencies over time, there does not have to be any racial or sexual animus behind that. But if it happens, it's going to generate a claim. It's also not the right thing to do. And if there is slippage over time, it is amazing how frequently, and again, there doesn't even have to be any intentionality behind this, but it is amazing how frequently an employer will look up and say, oh gosh, why is it that our female employees or African-American employees are being paid less on average than other candidates? We had no intentionality behind that. Their offer letters had the same number in them when they started here, and now it's a year later. What changed? What happened?
Yep.
Again, there doesn't have to be any intentionality behind it, but we think about things like passive bias, and that can creep in if you're not diligent. And now we're talking about things that will generate legal claims, not just sort of soft legal DEI initiatives, right? So I thought that was important to mention, because if an organization's not diligent about checking regularly to make sure that everyone's being treated equally on an equal playing field, it will slip over time. And it's interesting how it tends to slip along lines that either are actually or could be construed as, based on membership in a protected class.
Yes, 100%. We see that all the time with our assessments that we do. Although we measure culture, what we ask for when we do document analysis is, when was the last time you had a compensation audit? and disaggregate the data. That's the key term, is disaggregating when you are measuring and taking any data, because you need to be able to differentiate between gender and race, and being able to say that, are there any commonalities, are there any patterns that we need to be aware of? Some questions that we had in the comments is, what are some skills required as a hiring manager to be able to be considered a candidate's character without their own bias getting in the way? What are some skills required as a hiring manager
Yeah.
to be able to consider a candidate's character without their own bias getting in the way?
Yeah, I mean, tell me where you grew up. What did that teach you about life? How did that shape your professional experience? What has that
Hmm.
been like for you?
Yep.
Tell me about challenges that you faced with regard to your education or your professional life so far, and how did you rise above those?
Yep. Yep. It's
It
really,
tells you
really
a lot
good.
about somebody. Rather than, it says here you have a 3.8 GPA and you went to Penn. Great.
Yep. Yep. Yep, and being able to have those open-ended questions can really speak to someone's experience and also their lack of experience in diverse settings. Can either build up the culture that you're trying to create, or can hinder it as well. Um, that's really good. Another question is, when it says cohorts to content, really being able to say, is there a recommendation to move away from affinity groups? Is there a recommendation to move away from affinity groups?
Well, again, I go back to the idea that an organization can decide that it needs to interact more with affinity groups externally,
Right.
uh, that
Hmm.
it previously has not used those groups as access to talent, right, in a way that it might. So I don't think it's necessarily a recommendation to move away from affinity groups. Again, setting a quota or saying we need to be dealing with, you know, uh, a certain affinity group that we haven't before, or so many by the end of the year, or what have you, or making it explicitly about that, is closer to the line, but not
Yeah.
necessarily a wholesale recommendation to move away from those types of groups.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, and if I could add, the purpose of affinity groups or ERGs is really to create that added aspect of belonging to increase retention. And so I would say, yeah, the affinity groups and ERGs should continue to thrive within your organization if you do have them successfully. This more is speaking to how do you extend DEI programming so that everyone could have an opportunity to participate if they desire to. So instead of just having a group for women to look into their equity within the organization, how do you open that to all who support gender equity in the workplace? So it's really reframing, but keeping the purpose still alive as well. Um, and so with time, I want to be able to look at some the benefits really of being able to say that, with reframing, how do we look at how to conduct employee education or training? We know at Culture Enough that we conduct sessions based on psychological safety, emotional intelligence, bias, allyship, and inclusive leadership. And these have to do with creating an inclusive culture. And that's where we want people to really focus on as well, is looking at the culture of what they are creating, and really gearing these towards managers at the same time. And then also creating a more physically inclusive office environment. How can you do that with creating nursing rooms or childcare facilities? Looking at your office environment, and being able to say that, is this suitable for everyone who is at the workplace? Conducting outreach to broader range of colleges, just like you mentioned, Alex. Really diversifying that candidate pool, or partnering with community organizations who are already doing the work, and being able to say that, how can you increase your partnerships? How can you increase your relationships with that as well? Anything to add on that one, Alex?
No, I think these are all great points. Yeah, it sums up a lot of what we've spoken to before, but
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, I think in particular on the outreach, I mean, that's really the biggest point that I
Yeah.
emphasize, is that, like,
Yep.
usually when organizations audit, well, we've been reaching out to, many cases, it's the same old, top 5 schools in a region, right? Or,
Hmm.
and they just don't even think about going to a different place for outreach.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the common things that we're noticing is that when you have a homogenous leadership or homogenous managerial level, you have to really look at how promotion is happening. And if it's with your internal network, about who you know, versus strategically hiring, that's going to say a lot about your pipeline, and it's going to say a lot about who's in leadership as well.
Yeah.
So one thing that we want organizations to really go through is looking at strategies as well as all the strategies that were presented. Which ones are you doing and which ones can you reframe to be able to really still have an effective goal that is accomplished, as well to be able to have effectiveness within the organization at the same time. And so I think we have one more question in the chat that we could speak to before our time ends here. Can organizations embed psychological safety, EQ, inclusive leadership into their performance evaluations, and how do you do that effectively? I have answered. Do you have an answer, Alex?
Yeah. So those are, each one of those examples are different.
Mm-hmm.
But let's take, that's from my corner of the world, that's a little bit, there's a nuanced answer to this, which is that, for example, if somebody is going to be evaluated on their acumen to be an inclusive leader, if what we're saying is that there may be a performance evaluation that says that that person tends to treat members of a protected class differently, or has failed to hire, members of a certain cohort, that's going to lead to compliance issues, legal compliance issues, where either that person's being accused of, violating an anti-harassment or discrimination statute, which is something that typically an institution's not going to want to bring upon itself. And on the other hand, if what they're being accused of is, let's say, again, not hiring or not doing enough to hire from a certain cohort or what have you, then we get back to the quota discussion. However, if you take a holistic view of effective leadership, which would include the idea that you're not motivating the workforce to be the best version of itself, and you are not appropriately managing employees to be able to work collaboratively with one another, or incorporating the viewpoints that are present on your team effectively in a way to drive the organization's mission forward, those are adjacent performance criteria that are extremely important that may incorporate these kinds of ideas.
Yep. And what we do in our work is we break down the research behind the 4 quadrants of psych safety, the 4 quadrants of emotional intelligence, and make them competencies, so that if a manager is lacking in this area and cannot contribute to the culture that that is mission based, then there's an accountability that can be there. And Alex, I like how you framed it, and being able to hold them accountable to the culture that they're creating, where there is low psychological safety, or where there's preferential treatment with who is getting promoted or who's getting developed versus not. And so really being able to quantify that, but then also hold individuals accountable as well.
Yeah. And I guess to say it a different way, like you talk about psychological safety, like, there are ways that psychological safety can have implications on negative implications, or lack thereof psychological safety can have negative implications that are not directly proportional or directly tied to like membership in a cohort, right?
Right.
But so in other words, the manager's a jerk, right? The manager makes everyone feel on edge. The manager makes everyone feel like they're never going to be able to do enough, or that if they say something, or misplace a comma, they're going to get castigated, right? That has nothing to do with a cohort, but it could have a disparate impact on a cohort, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
So, but again, you're managing that, like you said, Alyssa, like you're managing that as a competency across the organization.
Across it,
which hopefully, again, would raise that high watermark and make sure that people from various cohorts feel included based on effective management of that particular competency.
Yep, absolutely. And I think to your other point earlier was that is why it is important for organizations to constantly assess their culture and constantly assess whether that is surveys or focus groups, or really being able to also have compensation audits so that you're constantly assessing to mitigate what could be a detrimental aspect to one of the protected groups. But what you really want is to be able to have a cohesive culture altogether, so that anyone could thrive within the organization and fulfill the mission of that organization. So we are at time. Thank you so much, Alex. Practical takeaways that we would love for you to take away with is just the strategies for adapting DI efforts, and avoiding that quota, avoiding those preferences, but really having a continued heart behind it, but also strategy behind it as well. And Alex had gone over different strategies that you can adopt at your own organization, shifting towards identity neutral approaches, as well as implementing mentorship programs for all employees, and utilizing partnerships, strategic partnerships, to be able to either diversify your pipeline or diversify your recruitment strategies as well. Consider evaluating candidates based on character. And Alex had mentioned a lot of great questions that you could add to your interview processes as well. And then also really engaging in approaches to promote workplace inclusivity. At the end of the day, it's going to come down to culture. Culture defines so much of who is retained, what is allowed. And we all know that what you allow and what you would tolerate actually dictates your culture. And so really being able to create accountability systems in place. Alex, are there any last words before we?
No, I guess I would just say this requires work, and that's okay. And I have seen for many of my clients, and in fact, the majority of my clients that do this work, that it pays dividends culturally and frankly toward the bottom line. And that can be a hard concept for them to grasp at the beginning of the process, but it really does have real world impact. These are not just theoretical concepts.
Right.
And again, I've seen it pay dividends for so many of my clients. So I would encourage people to kind of roll up their sleeves and seek out professionals to help with this. That's why, it's why we're here.
Yeah, that's
and we've seen it before, and we can help.
Yep. I love that. And being able to say that if done unintentionally, by default, there will be inequities. And so that is why we want organizations and leaders to be proactive, not reactive. Don't wait for another George Floyd. Don't wait for another precedent. To be able to be proactive about these strategies, because it does outperform. There is a business case for why this works, but also being able to say that morally as well, especially with the changing demographics of the United States come 2040, 2050. There will be a new majority within this country. And so wanting to prepare your workforce and your culture for that is where it's also going to be if you want your organization to last. Alex, how can they get in contact with you? I would love to put your contact information in our description as well.
Oh, sure. I'm always available by email.
Okay.
And you can find me at rccblaw.com. Just search for my name. And
Awesome.
I'm also available on LinkedIn. Any way you want to reach out, I'm available.